Welcome to the New Life Podcast. Today we are wrapping up our series on the Hall of Faith. We're going to look at the last few verses, the last few people, and to see what we can learn from their faith and how we can apply it to our lives as Christians today.
Yep. So, as you can tell, I'm wearing glasses for the first time.
He's finally wearing the glasses.
Yeah. So when this is coming out, I will be 30, and me and Savannah have an agreement that when I turn 30, that I have to be wearing my glasses.
It was more like a compromise on my part because I would have had you wearing them sooner.
Nope. You said you couldn't see me with them until I was 30.
Yeah, okay. I've been seeing you with them before.
Nope.
Little did you know, every time we'd record, Bill would take off his glasses right before we'd start.
Yep. And who knows? I'll probably get all these negative comments. I'll have to take them off.
No.
Just be blind for the episode. So our question for today is the age-old question. The question everybody wants to know. Is cereal soup?
Alright, so I thought about this. I went back and forth. But when we were talking about this briefly before, and I thought about my, if you eat or drink soup answer, then my response to that dictated my answer to this. So I would say that cereal is not soup. Or, yeah, not soup. I had to think about it for a second. Cereal is not soup.
Okay, explain. Why is it not soup?
Because I'm the kind of person who, with soup or with cereal, I'm not gonna drink the excess liquid.
Okay.
So once I'm done with the eating the cereal, then the milk is gone. I feel like if I made a point to use all the milk and make it part of that meal, then maybe I would say.
But I feel like what you're saying is the opposite.
Yeah, I don't know.
Because you
don't
drink
enjoying
the broth or nothing like that.
I'm only enjoying the cereal part of.
But you only
cereal.
enjoy the noodle part and the meat part of it.
I do enjoy the broth part a little bit more.
See, I would say that
confused.
it is soup.
You would say it is?
Yeah.
Breakfast soup?
Breakfast soup. Only because I was trying to think, well, is soup just hot? But I feel like there's cold soups.
Is there? There's probably cold soup.
Well, wait a minute.
I don't know.
Because I think people would, you could probably get, chowder cold. Can you?
Maybe.
I don't know. I don't eat chowder.
We're slowly learning. We're not qualified to answer
if
this
there
question.
is a cold soup, cereal is soup.
Yeah.
If there's no cold soups, then cereal's not a soup. That's it right there. That's how you answer that question. Okay. So, like you said, this is our last part. And tell us what you think. But we pretty much, no matter what you think, we just told you what it is. So.
We've had different answers.
Well, no, we clarified.
We did clarify. Your clarification made sense. My answer did not.
Yeah, because
I confused myself.
So, tell us what you think about cereal and whether or not it's a soup. So, this is our last part of our Hall of Faith series, and we've looked at Abel, we've looked at Enoch, we looked at Abraham, we've looked at Noah. We've looked at Isaac and Jacob and Joseph and Sarah. We've looked at all these key figures in the Old Testament and how their faith not only impacted their journey, but how their faith can also impact our journey in the Lord. And that's not. And as we finish up and as we kind of wrap things up, I hope that we just clarify that it's not easy, right? It's easy to say have faith, right? But it takes effort. All these people, what we're going to talk about here towards the end too, is that they all went through bumps, right? They were not perfect in their faith. They didn't always have great faith. There were times that they didn't have great faith. They had little faith, or maybe they doubted or whatever. And we did talk about that a little bit with Sarah and Abraham with their just not being able to have a child. But we're going to see that really every single one of these people that we've already talked about and that we're going to talk about today had lapses in their faith. But we can still persevere. We can still endure. And God still blesses those, even people that may have little faith. and because God looks at the heart, right? He's not
Mhm.
looking at what we do or our actions. He's looking at the heart. So that takes us to verse 23.
Yep. So jumping into verse 23, we're going to read 23 through 29. Says, "By faith Moses, after he was born, was hidden by his parents for 3 months, because they saw that the child was beautiful, and they didn't fear the king's edict. By faith Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, and chose to suffer with the people of God, rather than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. For he considered reproach for the sake of Christ to be greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, since he was looking ahead to the reward. By faith he left Egypt behind, not being afraid of the king's anger, for Moses persevered as one who sees him who is invisible. By faith he instituted the Passover and the sprinkling of the blood, so that the destroyer of the firstborn might not touch the Israelites. By faith they crossed the Red Sea as though they were on dry land, and when the Egyptians attempted to do this, they were drowned." So Moses here gets quite a few verses in the Hall of Faith, but I think that's fitting just because we do get so much of his story in the Old Testament. I mean,
He probably has the most
mm-hmm.
content, I guess,
Yeah.
if you want to put it that way, in all of the Old Testament for
You
a
literally
single
get
individual.
his birth to his death, and everything in between. So we see most of his story in the book of Exodus, but it also continues throughout Numbers and Deuteronomy, and then he's mentioned throughout. But with Moses, and I mean we see this with the verses mentioned. We first meet him when he's born in Egypt during a time where the Hebrew infants were being killed.
Mm-hmm.
But we see that his parents, they choose to protect him. We know that he's sent down the river, and he's found by the Pharaoh's daughter, who kind of takes her as his own and raises him up. So he grows up in this family, with, royalty. And then we see a time where, kind of a lapse of judgment, but he ends up killing an Egyptian, and he has to flee to Midian. From there, he's called by God in the form of a burning bush to lead the Israelites to freedom. There's all the plagues, which ultimately help them all get to the place where they can leave. And then they spend forever in the wilderness. And that's just like the briefest of brief summaries of Moses' life. But just from the first glimpse of the verses in Hebrews 11, we see that probably because we get so much context on Moses, so many different aspects of how he shows faith. And it's actually interesting because verse 23, the author's like talking about Moses' faith, but more of how it started with his parents, which I think is really cool. So the faith of his parents, I think, set Moses up to have this great faith later in his life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love how I think sometimes this gets glossed over because I did a message on this like a year ago, for preaching, and I never really noticed this part, that it really highlights Moses' parents, because I don't think it's something that you think about. Like you don't think about Moses' parents as being like these great people of faith, but here in the book of Hebrews, that's what the writer's highlighting, is that Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after he was born because they saw that he was no ordinary child, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. It started with their faith, right? If they didn't have faith, then he would have been killed with all the rest of the babies, and then God wouldn't have used him to free the people. They wouldn't have experienced this Red Sea moment. And again, what I think is interesting too is because we have so much about Moses, we're only getting really up to the Red Sea. But if you go further, you're going to see really if there was one word or one character trait to define Moses, I think it would be faith as well. Just like Abraham, Moses would also be in that same category, because it seems like every crazy moment that God calls Moses to, Moses goes, like he obeys and he does what he's supposed to. But also we see his parents do that, and you have to think about this for a moment. That there would be extensive consequences for hiding a child that you're not supposed to have during this time, right? You yourself could be killed, and murdered, and who else? Your family could be thrown along with that, and many other different things could happen, as well. But it says here that they weren't afraid of the king's edict. Why? Because they understood who God was, right? They understood how awesome the Lord is, and they understood that God could protect them, right? Give them a sense of security in a time where they didn't have that, right? They didn't have a sense of protection and security. So really, that's what faith should do in our life, right? It should give us a sense of protection and security, knowing that we're going to be okay, right? In the hands of God, there's nothing that mere mortals can do to you, right? That's the beauty of being in the hands of God, because you can't be destroyed. Even if they were killed for hiding Moses, God would still bring about good from it, and God would still use it for his will and his purposes. That should give us at least the confidence to keep the faith, even in times of uncertainty, in times of not just uncertainty, but maybe even times that are just a sense of maybe going against what everybody else is telling you to do, right? Because I'm sure that um, it wasn't easy to do this, right? In fact, we see later that like you were describing, like Moses' mom sends him down, a river, because I'm sure it was getting closer. Like we're gonna get caught.
Yeah.
And this is my only opportunity, to so my child doesn't get killed. And you think about that for just a moment. How nerve wracking that would be for a mother.
Yeah, and you just have to like hope that someone finds him along the way. But I think too with this is I love how after we hear so much about the faith of his parents, it jumps into the next couple of verses, and we see just like this first glimpse of Moses' faith, because obviously we know that she sent him down the river and he was safe, he was found, and he becomes part of Pharaoh's family. So he's literally royalty in this time, because the Pharaoh's daughter like takes him in as her own. But I think it's really cool that we see through Moses' life that he displayed his faith by choosing God over like the worldly pleasures. I mean, literally royalty. You have everything you want, like nice clothes. You don't have to like want for anything. People are waiting on you hand and foot. Like we saw Moses at Sight and Sound, and I mean, even just that depiction alone, you're like, okay, yeah, that's a pretty cozy lifestyle. And it would have been so easy to just like stay in that. And I know we like see glimpses of like Moses kind of understanding that maybe he's not like part of this family, like in the sense of like being born into it. But we like, but you see like how it could have been so easy to just stay where he's comfortable, stay where he knows he's going to have what he needs. In a sense, he has power by being part of this family. But instead, he chooses to give that all up, to be part of God's plan and to be with his people, knowing that there's probably going to be trials and suffering, because he's seen how his people have suffered in the city. And I think that too it reminds me of Matthew, like chapter 6, where it kind of talks about the, like our treasures aren't on earth, but, our store of treasures in heaven. And we see Moses doing that in a sense where he's giving up these worldly treasures for God, knowing that in the end, his reward in heaven is going to be greater. And I think that's something too that can just encourage us of, it's so easy to want to put our faith in money or our faith in things or our power, because we feel like that will make things easier in life. But when we take our eyes off of those things and put our eyes on the Lord, we know that our reward in heaven is going to be so much greater. And so I think that's just an encouragement to see where is our faith being put, today? Is it being put into those worldly things, or are we putting it in God?
Yeah. And you see here, it's I think it's important to understand the perspective here between these two things. What it's saying is he had everything. And it says basically he chose to give up everything in order to be with God's people, his own people. And I think this is important because he wasn't just choosing to go to just a low or a impoverished people. No, he chose to be with people that were slaves. Right? You go from having power and being in the Pharaoh's family, to choosing to be a slave, right? Those are complete polar opposites. But this is important because this is what faith in the Lord does. Though it may not sound extravagant or like royalty here on earth, it's you're choosing to be a slave to the Lord, right? In essence, like now you were a slave to the world, but now you're a slave to the Lord, a master who is good, who's righteous, who's just, who's fair. All those things that obviously wasn't happening in Pharaoh and that in Egypt, nothing like that, because the Lord is a good master who takes care of his people, who calls his people his children, who's adopted them. All those beautiful things. I think that's important to allow our faith to keep us in the understanding that here on earth, like what you said, we're not looking for the treasures of this world, right? We're storing up our treasures in heavens that comes by serving the Lord through our faith, that produces action and fruits into our life. And I think what's really cool about this part too, is not only this part but even the part before with his parents, is there's a common theme that's really being described here, and it's really not being afraid. Right? It says here that they weren't afraid of the king's edict. Moses here not being afraid of the king's anger, stuff like that. There's a common theme that's being talked about, and I think that's important because our faith in the Lord should produce fearlessness. Right? For the Bible says God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power, love, and a sound mind. Right? God isn't giving us fear that brings us down or keeps us from doing what He's called us to do. No, He's giving us, our faith should produce in us, our trust in the Lord, reliance on the Lord, should produce fearlessness, boldness, to do sometimes the opposite of what the world wants you to do, right? To stand by your convictions in the Lord, right? And this is what his parents do. This is what Moses did as well, that they chose their convictions in the Lord rather than the convictions of the world or man, because the world would tell you to do whatever you have to gain power and money and possessions and those types of things. But that's not what the Lord calls us to do, right? That's not what we should be putting our treasures in, those things as well.
Well, and like you were saying too, like with this idea of how faith really is like not letting fear stop you. I mean, we see that, like you kind of referenced it with verse 27, where it says that he wasn't afraid of the king's anger. For Moses persevered as one who sees him who's invisible. And I think we just also see that faith is perseverance. Like, I mean, Moses choosing to go against Pharaoh, obviously, that Pharaoh's not going to be happy about that, but he didn't, like you said, he didn't let fear stop him. He didn't let the possibility of these trials, this unknown, stop him from doing what God called him to do. God said, you're going to lead these people out of Egypt. And so he persevered through those trials to ultimately carry out what God had called him to. Despite knowing like it wasn't going to be easy and that there was possible like really big consequences for what he was going to do.
You see too when it talks about by faith the people passed through the Red Sea on dry ground, dry land, but when the Egyptians tried to do so, they were drowned. Here you see the contrast between having faith in the Lord and unbelief, right? Not having faith in the Lord is one leads to life and salvation, and one leads to destruction, right? Faith, the New Testament is scattered. Faith saves us, right? It's by faith we've been saved. that whole thing there. But it's also scattered throughout that without faith and sin and our own merits, our own works leads to destruction, leads to death. And I think this is what really the writer of Hebrews is also like. There's always these snapshots. And I know we're not really talking too much about those things, but they help our perspective and our faith, knowing that there are much greater things than just conquering whatever obstacle you have in front of you. That's great. That's awesome. You should do that. But there's even a greater perspective, looking forward to a greater thing, right? And that's what really being described here with Moses when he says he was looking ahead to his reward. He was looking ahead to the invisible, the unseen. That should be our perspective because, yeah, it's great to have a victory in life, but it's much greater to be looking forward to heaven, to be looking forward to Jesus and what he's accomplished and what he's done in our life to motivate us to keep going, to persevere, to not be afraid, the things that we're talking about that faith produces in our life. But I think it's important to see that faith leads to salvation, and that when we stand firm in that faith, God takes care of his people. And that's what you see there at the moment of the Red Sea. You can imagine Moses, like, at least maybe in the back of his mind, I don't know, maybe he had total trust in the Lord and didn't even skip a beat. But when the Lord's saying, hey, I want you to lift up your staff and these waters are going to part, and you're going to go ahead and walk on this dry ground with this water that's just stories high, and just hope it don't crash down on you. No, like it takes incredible faith to do that. Not just from Moses, but from the people as well, right? It's not just Moses being talked about here. It's the people that are following behind Moses. And I think, when that's a good point too, that faith allows, I don't even know the best way to say this, but faith shows, that's not it either. What I'm trying to say is that when a person of faith, a man or a woman, it produces desire in other people to follow, right? People aren't going to follow someone that doesn't believe the Lord's going to do what fulfill his promises, those types of things. But a person that has confidence and assurance and hope that the Lord's going to save us, the Lord's going to heal us, the Lord's going to lead us, all those things, that person is someone is going to want to follow. So if you want to be a good leader for the Lord, someone that people can imitate, follow, like the Bible describes, it has to start with a person of faith. It has to start with someone who has total reliance on the Lord. Because if you don't have confidence in the Lord, why would someone have confidence in you? So that's I think that's an important thing to highlight. But then we jump to this woman named Rahab. So verse 30 says, by faith the walls of Jericho fell after the army had marched around them for 7 days. By faith the prostitute Rahab, because she welcomed the spies, was not killed with those who were disobedient.
So Rahab's story is one, I feel like most of these in the Hall of Faith that we're just familiar with, but it's more specifically found in Joshua 2 and 6. But we learn that Rahab is this woman who's living in Jericho, and she's often we know her as like being a prostitute, and I feel like that's kind of the label that she's given. And 2 Israelites come into the city to kind of scout out the land because they're looking to conquer it. And we find out that Rahab offered to hide them and was willing to lie to the king's men in order to protect these 2 spies. But in return, Rahab and her family were spared when the Israelites later came in and conquered Jericho. So her story is not particularly long, but I think Rahab's story does such a good job at just reminding us that faith is action. And we've seen that with others mentioned in the Hall of Faith. But like, she demonstrated her faith by taking the risk to hide the Israelites. She didn't have to do that. It would have been safer probably for her to not have done that, just given what like the ruler of like her city had said. the authorities were saying, like, no, you have to turn these people in. But she took a risk because she believed that God was the one true God. And so she took the chance to save these men, and ultimately trusted that God would protect not only her, but her family for her willingness to do this.
And that's what's crazy about this story. Out of all the people in Jericho, there was one. And not only was there one, and it's very important because the writer's making it clear of what type of person this was, right? She was a prostitute. But she was the one that by her faith, was saved, and nobody else was. And that, again, that shows us that faith saves us, right? It's by faith that we're saved. And faith is what saved Rahab. That she took a risk, a huge risk. She went against all of her people, right? It wasn't like there was just a small number of people. But not only that, she interceded for her family. Right? It doesn't say this part, but if you go back and read the story, that she intercedes for her family as well. And that's the beauty of what we can do in faith, and ask the Lord to help our family, to save our family. And the Lord listens, and the Lord hears us when we cry out to Him by faith, right? Those things as well. But I think it's important to highlight the verse right before we start talking about Rahab, which is the story of the walls of Jericho. Because before this, like you were just saying, Rahab, they go in and they spy out the land, basically to see, like, how are they gonna take it, right? How are they gonna, which direction are they gonna come in? And then there's some pressure that happens, and they have to hide, and Rahab takes them in, hides them. But after that happens, they go back to their people. God tells Joshua to march around the city walls for 7 times. And that's what they do. And it's a pretty odd request from the Lord. That's not how you defeat a city, or that's not how you siege a city or knock down the walls. Like, you walking around it's not doing anything. I mean, if anything, the people are going to be laughing at you, thinking you're crazy, like, because you're not doing anything at that point. But so they're marching around the city, and then at the final day, they blow the trumpets, and the walls come tumbling down. And this shows me that faith requires, like what you said, perseverance. But it also requires patience, right? We can have faith, but doesn't mean the outcome's going to be immediate, right? It doesn't mean that it's going to come right away, right? It takes patience sometimes, especially when the Lord's like, hey, I want you to do something that's, maybe it's big, as much as conquering a city. Like, that's a big, major thing, right? That's not getting an A on a test, right? We're talking about different levels of things. That takes time. It takes patience. It takes reliance on the Lord, which is what the people did. And I think that shows us that God can, like what we've seen with other ones, is God can, by faith, we see God do the impossible. Something that shouldn't be ever happened, happened. And you can only experience those in the Christian life if you have faith, if you trust in the Lord. And I think this is important that we see with Rahab as well, with her in, kind of going against the grain of her people. Is she took her, not only that, is she, by hiding the spies, she went out of her comfort zone, right? This was a total risk, cost her life. But she decided that I'm going to get out of my comfort zone and go even much far beyond that. And I'm going to take a risk for the Lord, right? For the one true God. And that's what she does, which saved her. And not only did it save her, but it left a lasting impact on the legacy of the Israelites. That even when we see in the New Testament Jesus' genealogy, well, who's in this genealogy? Rahab is. Rahab the prostitute. And not only that, is it shows me that faith changes who we are.
Yeah.
Right? Rahab was a prostitute, but now she's much more than just that. And I think that's important to know, is that when you put your faith in the Lord, He completely changes you. Not only does He change your destination, but He changes your identity, right? You are a child of God, right? And only the reason why we see that she's always labeled as a prostitute is to show how amazing God can transform a life,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that's the only reason, honestly, I believe anyone should ever bring up their past. Like maybe you were a drug addict, maybe you had a sex addiction, or maybe it was something of those things, really hard things that really grab a hold of us and keep us. But but when you come to the Lord, He's transformed you. Those are the only times I really think we should highlight those sins of our past, is to show how God has transformed you in such a mighty and amazing way, which is what we see in Rahab. And that's what faith can do. It can transform your life.
That's what I think is really cool about Rahab's story, is really like you said, we always see her referenced as like Rahab the prostitute. But I think just with that, it also shows us that like God can use anyone regardless of their past. Like in this moment, like like we were saying earlier, she's not some wealthy person or someone with like battle skills or anything. She's just a person in the city who probably is looked down upon by most within the city, and God still used her. And because of that, she had this faith to trust in the Lord. And I think it just encourages us to understand that God can use anyone, no matter their past, and that if as long as we don't let our past stop us, we can have this faith to trust in the Lord in a way that glorifies Him, regardless of what our past looked like.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's Moses and Rahab. And my favorite part of this book is actually what we're about to read, which is verses 32 to the end of the chapter, because I think it gives us a lot of insights on the Lord's heart and why He would pick certain people for the Hall of Faith. So verse 32.
So verse 32 says, and what more can I say? Time is too short for me to tell about Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, and the prophets, who by faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, obtained promises, shut the mouths of lions, quenched the raging of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, gained strength in weakness, became mighty in battle, and put foreign armies to flight. Women received their dead, raised to life again. Other people were tortured, not accepting release, so that they might gain a better resurrection. Others experienced mockings and scourgings, as well as bonds and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawed in two, they died by the sword. They wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, afflicted, and mistreated. The world was not worthy of them. They wandered in deserts, on mountains, hiding in caves and holes in the ground. All of these were approved through their faith, but they did not receive what was promised, since God had promised something better for us, so that we would not be made perfect without us.
All right.
So a little bit of a not so cheery end. But like you said, I really do like these verses. For one, it makes me laugh just because he's like, there's just not enough time to, like, he could have written just pages upon pages of all these people. But it truly just shows us so many more ways in which faith was demonstrated, and how there were so many people who faced extreme adversity, like persecution, because of their faith, but they didn't let that stop them. And they maybe didn't get to see the promises like in their lifetime, but they had such great faith in what the Lord had planned that they were willing to, literally people were willing to die in like horrific ways because they just had such a great faith in the Lord. And I think it's just encouraging for like us today to be able to read these accounts, because at least as like American Christians, we're not facing as drastic of things. Obviously we might get some judgment or like ridiculed, but like I'm in my head, I'm like, okay, well, if someone can survive being sold into for their faith, not survive.
Yeah,
But
they didn't survive.
But if they can be willing to give up their life
Yeah.
to be sold into for their faith, like then it's one of those like, okay, I can handle a little bit of pushback from so and so because they don't understand like why I believe what I believe.
Yeah, and it's really I like what you said in the beginning because it does kind of start off in a funny way. Like he almost is saying like I've exhausted everything I can possibly say. Like I could tell you about these other people that are just as worthy to be in this hall of faith, and he lists some names like Gideon and Barak and Samson and Jephthah, and David and Samuel and the prophets and this whole. Then he goes through not only that he stops saying names, but he starts going through testimonies.
Yes.
And this is what I want to highlight because faith produces testimonies in your life. Maybe you're here and you're thinking, well, I'm just not really experiencing the hand of God in my life. Or like I'm not having these great, awesome moments or things like that. Maybe those are the types of things you're thinking. Well, I would always ask you, where's your faith? Where are you putting your trust in? Is your complete devotion to the Lord? Because if you want to experience these types of things, these impossible, amazing things, like conquering kingdoms and administering justice and shut the mouths of lions, quench the fiery flames, escape the edge of the sword, whose weakness was turned to strength and who became powerful in battle and routed foreign armies. And women received back their dead, raised to life again. And then he goes to a different type of testimony. These are like the impossible things that he goes through, and then he goes through persecution and sufferings and pains. Those are just as much worthy for maybe this isn't the right word, but exaltation as the other ones, because God looks at our perseverance through suffering and pain. And even to the point of willing to be martyred for the sake of Christ, the sake of the Lord in our life, God is pleased with it because we stood the test, right? We kept the faith. We didn't backslide. We didn't turn away. And this is what I do want to highlight this too, because maybe you're here thinking, well, what? All these people were not perfect. None of the ones we talked. Every single one of them. There are some that we don't know a lot about. And so I don't want to. I guess it shouldn't say that, but they were human.
They're human,
so they thought something wrong or they've done something wrong. But most of the people we've talked about, we know what they've done wrong because the Bible highlights it, and it shows us that these men and women were not perfect, right? They sinned before the Lord, and even with these names he mentions here at the end, every single one of these were not good people, in the sense of like they were somehow greater than everybody else, or they did no sin, or they were perfect, right? They were only good by what they're being characterized now is by their faith. That's it, because Gideon doubted that the Lord could accomplish great things through him. He said, who am I? I'm nobody. There's no way that I'm the one you're choosing. And he tested the Lord. Like if you're really calling, like he had God do these tests because he wasn't convinced, and then you see like Samson's story. And Samson I've always struggled with, because if you read his story in the book of Judges, he's a horrible guy, like
Poor Samson.
Horrible. Like I'm just being honest.
Yeah.
Like he was not a good guy at all, but at the end he redeems himself, and God saw that. God saw his faith at the end, and he was exalted for it, right? Admired for it, commended for it, is what we see here at the end. And even this weird guy named Jephthah, he was this amazing person in battle, and he made this stupid vow to the Lord that he was going to sacrifice the first person he saw if God would give him the victory. And his daughter walks in the door. And just a crazy story there as well. And there's every one of those have a story. David with the story of Bathsheba, and again so many other stories as well. But yet they were highlighted for their faith, and that's what I want us to understand. That your faith doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be It doesn't have to be to the point where you never have any doubts or you never have a lapse in judgment or anything like that. No, God will use your little faith and still do amazing things. God will even use your doubts as long as you're willing to persevere and willing to keep the faith. God will still use you for mighty things as long as you keep trusting in Him and you keep relying on Him. It is always better, even if it's small, to trust in the Lord. Even if you do have doubts or afraid or whatever that may be, it's still better to put your faith in the Lord in whatever circumstance that you're going through. I think that's what we see here mostly with all what he's saying here. Like even if you're going through persecutions, being tortured, sawed into, whatever, stoned to
Yeah.
death, right? You can still uplift the Lord through your faith.
Yeah.
And that I think there's one story that reminds me. And I know he's not talking about anybody in the New Testament here. He's talking about people in the Old Testament being persecuted. But if you look at an example in the New Testament, you see the story of Stephen. And he tells the people, the truth, and he's stoned for it. And he looks up to heaven and he says he sees the Lord standing at the right hand of God. And that to me shows that God is watching us in every single moment of our life. He's watching. Are you going to keep the faith, or are you going to run away? And I pray that those that are listening and watching to this keep the faith, because God sees it and God blesses those who keep the faith. And that's the point of this whole book, or this whole chapter, I should say. And not just this chapter.
It really carries out the whole book.
The couple chapters before and in the next couple after is this idea of persevering, to keep going, to not turning back, not going back to your sin. Keep trusting in the Lord. Keep putting your assurance in Him. Keep putting your hope in Him, because He's the one that's going to conquer the giants in your life. He's the one that's going to do the mighty things in your life. He's the one that's going to stand by your side in the face of persecution and death, which was happening then, which is why people were thinking about running away and turning away. The writer of Hebrews is saying it is still better to keep the faith, to die in it. To die in it if that's what it takes to keep the faith, because God will bless you for it. God will lift you up for it.
And I just think, like, looking at this too, is I really like verses 39 through 40. And I think just when you're reading them, like just as a Christian today, I think that these verses can really act as an encouragement to us, because we're reminded of all, like, just like the author is reminding the individual he's writing this letter to, that of these people, like, we're reminded of all these people in the Old Testament and their faith. And it's these people, they ultimately didn't get to see all of God's promises come to be. They heard about a lot of them. But today, we know of those promises. We've seen them fulfilled. And we also have now the blessing of Christ from those promises. We see the blessing of Christ. And so it's like, because of the faith of these people who came before us years and years and years ago, we now get to experience the joy of salvation through Jesus, because they had faith to trust in God's bigger promises that were way down the line that they never got to see.
And the last part is really amazing, because what you said, but also what the writer is trying to show us, that these people were commended for their faith, yet none of them received what had been promised, since God had planned something better for us. Right? There's also a sense that because now we see the finished work of Jesus, we have something they didn't. Right? We see the finished work of Jesus. We know who Jesus is. They didn't know that. Right? They were looking for it, yet they were still commended for their faith. How much more should we keep the faith now that we see the finished work of Jesus in our life as well? So yeah, really, really awesome stuff. And then together, right, we're made perfect. Right? Again, you maybe have questions. Well, how was the people of the Old Testament saved? How are we saved? Same way, by faith. So we've seen so many different things through this, from verse 1 to verse 40 here in this chapter. Many different people. And maybe you're here, and some of the qualities that we've seen. Maybe you're here and you say, well, maybe I need perseverance. Have faith. Maybe you want godly character. Have faith. Maybe you want a close walk with the Lord, a close relationship with Him. Have faith. Maybe you're uncertain or there's difficulties in your life and you're afraid.
Mm-hmm.
Have faith. So many different examples that all start with having faith.
Mm-hmm.
So many things that we need in life. Provisions, security, protection, all happen by faith. So if there's one thing that I would always encourage a believer to keep going in, it's faith, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's what Paul describes in Timothy, where he's telling Timothy, keep the faith, fight the good fight, run your race, keep going, don't fall back, don't look behind, keep striving for what is ahead. For God has a much greater plan for you in this life, in the life to come, for those that keep running, those that keep the faith. So yeah,
Mm-hmm.
God, know that God's promises are always sure. They're 100%. You can put your trust in them, even when it may seem hard, or you're not for sure, or impossible. God will still bring it about. God will still keep His promises. So, any final thoughts?
I think just to reiterate what you said, it's just to have faith, even in those days where it feels like you're just like scrounging the bottom of the barrel and it feels like you have like the lowest of low faiths. Just keep having faith because, like you said, God keeps His promises. And so, like, we just have to be willing to trust that God is going to do what He says He's going to do. So just have faith.
So that concludes our episode for this week. That concludes our series of the Hall of Faith. Share with us maybe a series you'd like to see us do here on the podcast, and we'll see if we can do that.
Yeah.
And again, share with us if you think cereal is a soup. And make sure you like, subscribe, all those awesome things that we would love you to do. And as always, thank you for listening to the New Life Podcast.